which is the best. So I'm going to start with the Giro Empire VR90, very nice shoe. The first thing you're immediately going to notice is that it has laces. Obviously a fairly old technology, but a fairly new technology in mountain bike shoes. The glaring omission with laces is that you lose the ability to adjust your shoe on the fly. So if you get hot feet or hot spots or anything like that, you have to get off your bike, undo the laces and redo them up. In practice, I found that I didn't really have to do this because you can get the fit really spot on because there's points of adjustment all the way up the shoes. Instead of there being a couple of boas or one strap there and a strap at the bottom, that can often dig in and create the hot spots. It's a very kind of even fit all the way up. That said, it does take a bit of practice to learn how to get the laces just right. I found the first few times I went out with these shoes, I'd crank them too hard, and I'd find that after a half hour or so I'd have to just loosen them off a bit, but it just takes a bit of practice. The other slight problem with the laces is that if you're doing some muddy events or if you're riding in the mud, and I rode these in some really epic conditions, some World Marathon Series races, is that around the laces it can kind of clog up with mud and add quite a bit of weight to the shoe, and obviously these are race shoes, so that's all extra weight you have to carry. You might think that that means they're difficult to clean, but in practice I found they're actually very easy. You just need to whip the laces out and the fairly smooth, uniform upper just wipes down really easy. Onto the fit of the shoes, these size 45s seem to come up a little smaller than other size 45s I've ridden before. It's not a good or a bad thing, but just something worth bearing in mind. The last is fairly neutral, so there's not much kind of scoop in your foot or rise in your toes, which isn't a good or a bad thing, it's just down to personal preference. A neat little addition that Giro have got is that they have adjustable arch inserts in the footbed, so you have high, medium and low. I found I just stuck with the medium and it suited my feet quite well. Much like other Giro shoes, the heel cup is absolutely rock solid. It's pretty thick really, you don't kind of expect it to be that thick, and it did cause some slight scuffing on the heels just there on the cranks, but only very minor. But yeah, once you've got that shoe tightened up, there is absolutely no heel slip at all. Onto the sole, being a high-end cross-country shoe, it's obviously made of carbon fibre, meaning incredibly stiff and none of your energy is being wasted, it's all going straight to the pedals. The tread is a Vibram grip, very nice. It's fairly tacky, so it's quite good for walking in on kind of dry rocks and stuff like that, but I did find, because the tread is fairly smooth, that on wetter conditions or greasy conditions, running in the mud, or any time it gets wet, is that it's not actually as grippy as you want it to be. I think it do slightly better with some more deep channels in the grip. One thing I really like about the sole is the large piece of rubber there. It's really good for protecting the middle of your foot. If you slip a pedal, you're not going to hit carbon and slide off, causing a crash. You find that you can actually get a bit of grip from that little bit of rubber there. But one thing I would like to see, but I mean this is the same for nearly every cross-country shoe these days, is to make the parts of the tread replaceable instead of it all being moulded to the shoe, because once that wears out, your shoes are finished really. A final note is that the Giros are actually pretty tough. There's a really good strong bit of rubber on the toe box. I use these in some really nasty rocky races. There was ones where I had to hike a bike and stuff like that, and they've just stood up to a real beating. Onto the Mavic Crossmax SL Ultimate, another very high-end race shoe. The first thing you're going to notice compared to the Giro shoe is that it's got a dial retention system. This is Mavic's own ergo dial retention system. The adjustment on the shoe is very fine, so each click does about 0.5 mil. In practice, that's really good for getting the fit dialed in just right, but I did find that it was quite difficult to get them really tight. Whether or not this is down to the dial or the wires, it's difficult to say, but I definitely found I had to crank them a lot harder than I've cranked dial retention systems before. Onto the fit of the shoe, and this is where for me the Mavics won big. What you can't see on the camera is that inside the shoe there's very generous padding that runs all the way down. It's really comfortable and it's kind of smooth all the way over, so there's no bits of the shoe or seams or anything like that dig into your foot. Another thing I like, because I've got weird Hobbit flipper feet where they're quite long, very wide at the end, but then very thin ankles, is that the toe box is very wide, quite often I find that shoes come a bit narrow, but if the end of your feet are quite wide, these fit really well. Whereas the heel cup is still fairly narrow, so you get a good bit of grip there. I'd say it isn't quite as secure as the Giro. The fabric inside is quite smooth, and I think you might need some directional fabric just to kind of lock your heel into place, but it's not a deal breaker, and it was kind of more apparent when I was walking, and as soon as you clip into the bike and start pedaling, it didn't feel like I was losing any power. Once again, it has a fairly neutral last, so there's not much kind of arch support built into the shoe. Onto the sole, much like the Giro, super stiff carbon sole, pretty standard on race shoes like this. The rubber's a bit more tacky, so it's nice and grippy. Another thing I liked is that there's these deep channels built into it, so it's a lot better in sort of muddy conditions and things like that. That being said, I did find that with those two exposed carbon bits just there, that they were a little bit more slippy if you slip a pedal compared to the Giros. Not as bad as some shoes, but it's definitely worth taking into consideration. If you like cyclocross, you've got places to put studs, and as I've just said, big deep channels for grip in the mud. So all in all, a great lightweight, grippy sole, but just like the Giro, you can't replace the gripper, which is a bit annoying. I found the Mavics were a little bit cooler than the Giros and performed a bit better in the heat, just down to these perforated channels in the upper. So the Mavics would have been a strong contender for the win, but for one problem, and it's down to the side of the shoe here. After only a couple of rides, I immediately noticed I started to wear down the rubber. It's a bit of a deal breaker on such a high-end shoe, and I even found that it was starting to wear down the heli tape on the outside of my crank. So bad that I could even hear it squeaking every time I was kind of cranking around like that, because just there the rubber's quite sticky as well, so it kind of, every time I was cranking around, you hear it like that, and that's obviously power being lost through friction. It's difficult to say why. I think it kind of comes up quite high there, so if it just sat a little bit lower, if the seam sat a bit lower, it could help, but it's very difficult to say. As you might have guessed, if I had to recommend one shoe, I'd recommend the Giro. They're marginally lighter than the Mavics, they're ever so slightly cheaper, the sole is really durable. Same again with the upper, it looks like it might rip easily, but I found that I never ripped it on rocks or anything like that. The laces are a bit of a faff once you get them dialed in, but once you learn how tight to get them, they're just a kind of fit and forget product. That being said, the Mavics are a really good shoe. The only problem is the crank rubbing, and at that price, it's a bit of a deal breaker. Giro versus Mavic, two high-end cross-country shoes, but which is the best? So I'm going to start with the Giro Empire VR90, very nice shoe. The first thing you're immediately going to notice is that it has laces. Obviously a fairly old technology, but a fairly new technology in mountain bike shoes. The glaring omission with laces is that you lose the ability to adjust your shoe on the fly, so if you get hot feet or hot spots or anything like that, you have to get off your bike, undo the laces and redo them up. In practice, I found that I didn't really have to do this because you can get the fit really spot on, because there's points of adjustment all the way up the shoe, so instead of there being a couple of boas